Okay, well, so let's get started. Again, thanks for joining me today. This is the second of our quarterly webinars, although we're starting it at the start of the third quarter. And topic is fuel tests that you need to know about. I am Eric Bjornstad. I'm Technical Information Director here at Bell Performance. We've been in business for a long time. We have a lot of relationships, and we've done a lot of services in business with entities that use stored fuel. And given how important that stored fuel is to their business, to the people that who are our customers, we find that it's really important to stay on top of the best practices that are recommended to keep that fuel healthy and viable and ready to go. So that's what we wanted to do today's topic, stored fuel testing, because that's a really critical piece of the puzzle. And so by the conclusion of our time together today, what we're going to aim to do is we want to make you more familiar with stored fuel and how important stored fuel testing is. So we're going to start with context. We'll talk about how important stored fuel is for different kinds of customers across the B2B spectrum. We'll talk about where this concept of fuel testing fits in with them relative to how they use the stored fuel, what they use it for. What value does testing of stored fuel bring to these different kinds of users relative to what they do? And then we'll get into some specifics. What are the tests that are recommended for these people to pay attention to? What are those tests going to show? How are they run? What do they mean? And then lastly, we'll tie it all together for each test by talking about what potential action steps or action items does a negative test infer that they should do in order to fix whatever problem it indicates might be on the horizon for them. So let's start off our discussion with a consideration of stored fuel itself. If today's fuels were not substantively different from yesterday's fuels, we probably would not be having this kind of discussion that we're having today. So today we're primarily going to be talking about diesel fuel, because we're not really going to touch that much on stored ethanol gasoline, because diesel fuel makes up the vast majority of the stored fuel pool, so to speak. So when you're talking about how diesel fuel has changed, you're talking about three major areas. You're talking about the reduction in the sulfur content, first of all. You're talking about other changes to the petroleum fuel composition. And then you're talking also about the growing presence of biodiesel. So when you bring up sulfur content, we all know that ultra-low sulfur diesel became the default, law of the land around 2007 or so. You take sulfur out of diesel fuel, makes it more environmentally friendly, to be sure. Reduces sulfur gases linked to acid rain, makes the emissions cleaner, and better also for the advanced emissions control systems that are now pretty much standard on the newer diesel engines. They do not like excess sulfur content in the emissions. So around 2007, they capped sulfur content at 15 ppm. Second thing, when you talk about change in the fuel composition, you're talking about reduction in aromatic content. Aromatic content is one of the kind of fuel streams that refineries can use to make up fuel when they're blending the fuel, putting it all together. They can vary the aromatic content in order to make sure that the fuel's specs and properties are what it's supposed to be. And they know that if they reduce the aromatic content, they tend to get cleaner emissions. So that was also part of the mandate. Lower the aromatic content, help the emissions become cleaner. And then the third major change, you're talking about biodiesel. Most diesel fuel today has at least 5% that biodiesel content, and there's a number of reasons why this came to be. So some of them, there's always a political angle with this, with the renewable fuels angle. Some of it was environmental, because biodiesel burns cleaner and has fewer harmful emissions, so the fuel's better for the environment. So three major ways that fuel's changed, but as is with many things, for all the benefits that they got for making those changes, you got some unintended and unavoidable consequences that went along with it. So that's why we say that, when we're talking about this, the benefits did not come without a price tag. And the price tag that we're talking about is a concurrent change in the fuel's ability to have certain kinds of problems. And so there's three main areas of change and three main problem areas that we have to consider here. We're talking about microbial activity in the fuel, we're talking about water presence, and fuel stability. So first one, today's diesel fuels are significantly more prone to developing microbe problems than the fuels of decades past because both sulfur content and aromatic content tended to inhibit microbial growth. You take those out, you make it easier and more hospitable for microbes to grow in that fuel and in that storage tank. And so when you're saying, if today's fuels are more prone to microbe problems, that means they're more prone, when you say they're more prone to having microbial presence, that means they're more prone to the problems that presence brings along with it. Some of those problems are, can be relatively minor, like, more filter plugging, for example. Some of them can be pretty major when you're talking about tank, major storage tank corrosion damage and degradation of the stability of the fuel. And beyond these fuel-specific problems, microbes themselves can be a pretty difficult problem to get rid of. Because of the nature of a microbial infestation, they can spread pretty easily from place to place. And if you don't know you have a microbial infestation, that makes it even worse because you'll be spreading it, unwittingly. So that's the first one. Second one, you're talking about the reduction of the sulfur and the creation of ultra-low sulfur diesel has made a diesel fuel that attracts and holds water more so than in times past. Some of it is due to the biodiesel content, some of it's due to the inherent nature of ULSD itself. So anytime you have a fuel blend that attracts and holds more water, then you'll have more water-related problems that can result, like microbial growth, again, storage tank corrosion, and both of these problems, microbial presence and water presence, both of those contribute to an overall reduction in the storage stability of the fuel, the third one that we mentioned, along with another factor which is played in, which is greater use of cracked fuel stocks. Refineries have had to use more and more cracked fuel stocks in order to meet their volume quotas, and cracked fuel stocks make the fuel inherently more unstable than fuels from the past. So those main areas, and the problems that go along with them. After considering today's fuels and these problems, next we have to consider the effects of these problems and how much they impact the different groups that use the fuel. So mainly we're talking about B2B groups here. We're talking about groups that either store fuel to use it themselves to, get business done, or groups that serve a customer base that relies heavily on stored fuel and fuel storage tanks. In that case, we'd be talking about service entities. So the kinds of groups we're talking about state and local municipalities, or what we would term government entities. We're talking about hospitals and healthcare facilities. They rely a lot on stored fuel. We're talking about fuel service providers. So providers that go out, they clean tanks, they mechanically process fuel. You've got both backup generator owners and the service companies for those generators. And then you've got this non-retail fuel user group that really can cover a whole range of entities, everyone from like telecom, groups that manage servers and information technology, to like private fleets like FedEx. FedEx would be FedEx and UPS delivery services would be non-retail fuel users that use stored fuel. For each of these groups, stored fuel plays a pretty important role in their business. And so when you're talking about fuel testing is going to bring a certain amount of value to each one of these groups. So government municipal users, what do? Well, whether you're talking about a county entity or a city entity, typically they're charged with providing the basic services that the residents rely on being provided in exchange for the tax revenue that they pay. So you're talking about stuff like sanitation, water utilities, you're talking about street and infrastructure maintenance, fire departments, police, that kind of stuff. So government and municipal users, they rely on stored fuel to execute those functions. Like a police station might have emergency backup generators that kick on during emergencies to make sure that the police station and the call center still has power. So for these groups, preserving the health of this stored fuel is pretty important, because if it fails and they're not able to do what they need to do at all times, then they fail their constituents, and that's serious trouble. One of the big benefits of fuel testing for government groups is it can help them monitor and stay ahead of any possible changes in the condition of their stored fuel so that they are not caught off guard. Speaking of having to provide services at all times, hospitals and healthcare facilities, right? Their constituents are their patients. And so hospitals and healthcare facilities are required to have backup generators, and they're required to have stored fuel that meets certain specifications at all times. Because if their stored fuel fails and their backup generators fail, well, then you get situations like what happened with, back with Hurricane Katrina, with Superstorm Sandy, when there were hospitals whose generators failed and they were not able to provide the care that they needed to at a really critical time. And so you have regulatory agencies like ACA, which they oversee making sure that these hospitals do what they need to do. And I realized that I believe I spelled ACA incorrectly there. It's actually AHCA. But ACA has certain requirements for hospitals and healthcare. Like, for example, hospitals required to test backup generators at least once a month and run them for at least 30 minutes. They have to do that. They're also required, with respect to fuel testing, they have to have paperwork that shows that on an annual basis, their stored fuel meets the ASTM D975 requirement, which is the basic diesel fuel specification requirement. Basically, they have to verify that their fuel is in spec at least once a year. Fuel service providers, that's a third major group. Now, they're a little bit different from hospitals and from government in that they don't have stored fuel themselves that they take care of. Their service revolves around taking care of the fuel of other people. And so a typical thing that they would do is they would service another person's tank and fuel by doing fuel filtering to remove particulates and contaminants from the fuel. They would take out water. They would apply treatment chemicals to the fuel either before, during, or after service. And then many of them would actually do actual tank cleaning itself as well. So for the people who are their customers, they engage the services of a fuel service provider because they need to get rid of an existing problem that they've detected in their fuel, and they want to make sure that that fuel is improved or set up so that it's not going to have problems in the future. And so that's what the fuel service provider is expected to do. And what that means is that if the customer has a fuel problem and it manifests itself in some undesirable way for that customer, who's going to get blamed for that? Well, the customer is not going to look at themselves and say, oh, I should have taken better care of my fuel. No, they're going to blame the fuel service provider because that's what the customer expected the fuel service provider to do. So where does fuel testing fit in for these people? Well, one of the things that it can do is that it can help a service provider, let's say, differentiate themselves from the less credible operators. We'll just be diplomatic and say the less credible operators in their industry, because there are plenty of those. See, a fuel service provider can use before and after fuel testing to show their customer that their fuel improved in a meaningful way and that it was objectively measured, so that the customer doesn't have to just take their word for it. They can see that the fuel's specifications have changed in a positive way, and that's good. Fourth group, generator owners and service companies. Lots and lots of people, and we can probably roll non-retail fuel users into this, even though not all non-retail fuel users are strictly generator people. But there are lots of different entities that have backup generators. Like, we already implied that hospitals have them. But you've also got, grocery stores. You've got data centers, telecom. Large telecommunication companies like Verizon and Sprint have backup generators with their cell towers, and they all have stored fuel. So we would call these groups kind of like mission-critical entities. And for the bulk of these groups, their primary business isn't making sure their generator and its fuel is okay. Their primary business is, selling groceries or delivering packages or making sure that the cell towers stay online. That's their primary business. And so what they do is they rely on service companies to keep the generators in prime shape. And so those service companies, what they also need to do is they need to pay attention to the fuel as well, because just like we talked about earlier, if the generator fuel's gone bad because it hasn't been checked for years by the customer, if it goes bad and their generator fails and that company is not able to do the business it needs to, the company is not going to look at itself. They're going to look at the service company, and they're going to say, you guys didn't do what you needed to do, even if it's not really the service company's fault. So the question that follows here for all of these groups, all of these stored fuel users is, what are the fuel tests that they should do? What should they consider? Fuel testing obviously has great amount of potential value for each of them. But it's a broad subject, and identifying where that value is can be difficult if you don't have the proper direction, so to speak, if you don't know what tests are the best ones to run. So what are the best tests to run? Well, in order to answer that question, you need to have a handle on what you're looking for. And in order to, after you know what you're looking for, then you need to know what tests are going to tell you what you're looking for. Basically, in a nutshell, if you're approaching this from a high-level view, you need to know what current state your fuel is in, if it's good right now or if it's not. And it also would be useful for you to know how long it's likely to stay that way, or if there are any possible problems that may be possibly on the horizon for you. And so the best fuel tests for you are going to be the ones that give you that kind of information. And by and large, the best fuel tests that we're talking about are the ASTM tests. ASTM tests are kind of the gold standard tests, if you will. ASTM is the American section of the International Association for Testing Materials. And they have all of these test procedures for measuring certain kinds of things in fuel, among other things. And these procedures have been developed in conjunction with consultation with industry groups, the groups that actually know what's going on the field level. The advantage of ASTM fuel tests are multiple. First of all, they're reproducible. That means there's a defined test protocol that can be done a specific way by anybody, and that means that the results that you get from those tests are comparable across the spectrum. That means that somebody in California who runs a test can take his results and compare it to the results on the same test done by somebody in Detroit and somebody in Miami and somebody in Romania and somebody in Nigeria. They're all comparable provided they followed the test protocols. And there's plenty of places for them to have these kind of tests run as well. So, ASTM tests, let's dive into the tests themselves, okay? We've spent some time setting up the context here. Let's talk about the tests. We need to know which tests should matter most to those that rely on stored fuel, right? We want to have some context on how they're run so that we understand them a little bit better. We want to know what each test will tell us and, if possible, what it doesn't tell us. And then we want to be able to apply it to the different kinds of stored fuel users and see what the value of each test might be for them. All right, so first recommended test that we're going to throw out there is the ASTM D2709, Water and Sediment Content. Now, this test is one of the ones that's specified in the D975 standard. That means in order for something to legally call itself diesel fuel, it has to pass this test. Now, how do they run this test? Well, they take a fuel sample, and they put it in a centrifuge, and they centrifuge it so that all of the water and sediment that's actually in the fuel sample goes to the bottom. Then they can isolate it, and they can measure it as a percentage of the volume of the fuel. And that's what the test is measuring. It's measuring the amount of water and the amount of sediment that's present in the test. Now, what does this fuel tell us about possible problems that for somebody whose test doesn't, whose fuel comes back with a subpar result on this test? Well, first point is that if you have excess water in that fuel, that's a key supporter of microbial growth in fuel and storage tanks. And this is a universal problem, whether it's hospitals, backup generators, really anybody who relies on stored fuel. Having too much water and having possible microbial growth is a serious, serious issue. Second thing is that if you have a failing reading on this water and sediment test, it's actually a strong indicator or a strong correlator to the presence of actual tank corrosion damage in that storage tank. That was one of the conclusions that the EPA found in their July 2016 field study of storage tanks. It was the number one correlator. A failing test on water and sediment in a fuel sample was the strongest correlator they found to actual going into the tank that they pulled that fuel out of and looking at the inside of that tank and seeing moderate to severe corrosion damage. Water and sediment content, of course, also affects how the engines and the equipment run that use that fuel. And for the service entities, fuel service providers and generator service entities, this kind of test is one of the ones that's useful to document to their customers how they have improved the fuel's specifications from before to after. So they can show the customer that before the service, the fuel failed this test, it had excess content, and after they did their fuel servicing, the fuel was brought back in the spec. They can show that to the customer, and the customer has proof that they did something meaningful for their fuel. So, if you have a failing test on this, what does this imply that your plan of action should be? Well, first thing to consider is the only way to correct a poor result on this test is to actually remove that water and sediment content. I mean, it makes sense, right? This implies the need for some kind of tank cleaning and fuel filtration or fuel cleaning in order to do this. So this is good news for the fuel servicing market. This kind of test, this kind of water and sediment test, demonstrates the need for their services. Now, a good fuel servicer or a good fuel cleaner, so to speak, they're going to do a number of different things. They're going to use a combination of tank cleaning services. They're going to do actual filtration, mechanical fuel filtration of that fuel, and they're going to add certain kinds of chemicals to the fuel. They do all that together, and they give the customer a complete solution. The filtration and the fuel some people call it fuel polishing, but the fuel filtration removes the water and sediment, which brings the fuel back into spec. But if they don't also add some kinds of like stabilizers or water control elements to that fuel, they're not going to be able to do anything by keeping the problem from coming back, which is implicitly also what the customer expects, right? So a good fuel service company will also incorporate quality chemical fuel treatments such as fuel stabilizers and biocides as well, in order so that that fuel will stay in spec for as long as possible after they leave. So this water and sediment test, first essential fuel test that all users of stored fuel really need to be aware of. Second recommended test is called the Cetane Index test. This is ASTM D4737, and it is able to estimate the cetane value in that fuel. Now, there's another test called a cetane number test, D617. It's important to note that they are not exactly the same. They both tell you the same thing. The cetane number test measures the cetane value of that fuel. The cetane index test actually gives a very good estimation of that same value from a couple of other simpler tests that it uses. It measures the density of the fuel, and then they also run a distillation curve. And there's a specific formula that the ASTM has come up with that they plug those in, and they're able to very accurately calculate what the cetane value of that fuel should be. Now, what's the difference? Why do they have to do an estimation versus just measuring it? Well, it comes down to difficulty and cost. The cetane number test is actually run on a specific kind of engine that not very many people have, so it's expensive and it's time consuming. It can cost you, I don't know, maybe like $1,000 to run that test, and most people don't want to spend $1,000. So the cetane index test is reliable enough that legally you can use it as a substitution for the cetane number test. Second caveat, and we'll touch on this again a little bit later in some other aspects, is that the cetane index test is good for telling you the starting cetane value, the baseline of that fuel. But if you add cetane improvers to try and raise the cetane number or the cetane value of that fuel, the cetane index test can't actually detect that change because of the fact that it's using results from other tests in order to estimate that value. Now, you might say, well, if it can't do that, then why do I need to consider it? Well, because it's very valuable in telling you if you have a possible problem that you need to take corrective action on. What we're going to touch on here in a minute is that because you can't document if that action has actually worked, you're going to have to rely on other people to be able to tell you if that's happened or not. And therefore, you need to have a partner that you can collaborate with that you can actually trust that they know what they're talking about if they say, yes, your problem should be solved, or no, you need to do a little bit more. All right, so given that cetane and cetane index are reflections of the combustion quality of the diesel fuel, what would a subpar test value tell you about possible problems that might result? Well, the problem with the subpar cetane rating in fuel is that the fuel is going to have a combustion deficiency. It's not going to burn as well as it should in that engine. So you're going to have starting problems. You're going to have rough operation. You're going to have more black smoke production. And if the cetane value has, let's say you've got some really, really old fuel that hasn't been checked for a long time and the cetane value is just really, really down in the dumps, it's possible that that engine may not actually even start, or it may not actually even maintain load if you try to use it on this bad fuel. And that is an important implication for people like people have emergency backup generators, hospitals and healthcare groups. If the fuel isn't going to support the operation of their essential backup systems, they have a real problem. And it also has important implications for fuel polishers, for fuel service companies, because again, if they're servicing their customers' fuel, and one of the problems with their customers' fuel is poor cetane rating, but they don't know about it, When that when that customer goes to use that fuel and it doesn't do what they're supposed to, again, who's going to get blamed for it? The fuel service company, because they were the last ones to have touched that fuel, and they should have solved that problem. Whether that's fair or not is another issue, but they are the ones that are going to get blamed for it. So, poor cetane value in fuel. What should you do? What's the action step? Well, the action step is actually pretty easy here. A problem with low cetane value in fuel is a little unique in that it can't be remedied by the removal of something. There's nothing, it's not like the water and sediment test where you remove excess water and sediment, you solve the problem. The remedy is actually to add a chemical cetane improver, something that you can blend into the fuel that actually raises the overall cetane value. Now, if you do this, then you're going to make the diesel engine or the piece of equipment easier to start. It's going to run more smoothly, and it's going to have less black smoke emissions. And so for somebody who's really relying on that, it's also going to give them better peace of mind. How would you feel if you had a essential backup generator and your fuel service provider came to you and said, this test shows that your cetane in that fuel is 36 and it needs to be at least 40, 45. So you have them solve the problem. What kind of peace of mind would that give you, and what kind of value would that be for you? It'd be pretty substantial, right? So cetane improver additives today, the dominant chemistry is what they call 2-EHN, 2-ethylhexyl nitrate. It's a pretty powerful chemical, and depending on how much you add, you can very easily raise cetane rating of fuel by at least 2 to 6 points, and typically more if you use more of it. Just depends how much your fuel needs. Now, exactly how much you would need to use depends on where your fuel is starting from. And this is where we cycle back to that thing we were talking about earlier. Cetane index test won't tell you after you've added cetane improver how much that has increased. What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to rely on the entity that's adding or servicing the fuel or adding the cetane improver to know the proper amount to add. Now, it's not rocket science, so to speak. There are specific, well-documented calculations that can very reasonably tell you how much you're likely to need to have. But the average group, the average telecom company or government entity, they don't know that. But fuel service providers should know that. And that means whoever you partner with to service your fuel and take care of this problem, you need to be able, first of all, to know that they know what they're talking about if they recommend something. And you need to know that you need to have confidence that the recommendation has your best interests in mind. If you have a fuel service provider or a service partner that you can have confidence that that's true, then you can have confidence that that problem's been solved, essentially. Okay, so that's water and sediment test, cetane index test. Third test, very important, microbial presence test. Okay, this is more important than ever. Microbial presence in stored fuel that serves any kind of critical function is not something that you want to mess around with, not at all. But it used to be that in order to check for microbial presence, the only options used to be that you take a fuel sample, you ship it off to a lab, and you'd have to wait like 28 days for the culture results to come back. Well, that's just not going to work. It's too long. And luckily, those days are behind us. There are a number of different options available to people on the field level that allow for them to do actual in-field, on-the-ground testing for microbial presence in their fuel. So let's talk about three main kinds here. The first one is what we would call a test culture strip. Some people might call them a dip slide, and there should be a picture of that here at the bottom of the slide there. There's different kinds of them. They're really easy to use. Basically, they just you have the fuel, you dip them in the fuel, you put them in a sealed container, and you wait 3 to 5 days. So it's not 28 days; it's maximum 3 to 5 days, and they'll give you a rough indication. They're an indicator. Yes, you have a microbe problem. No, you don't. There are some of them that will also distinguish between different kinds of microbes. Yes, you have a bacteria problem, you don't have a fungus problem. And that can be useful because that certain kinds of microbes respond better to certain remediative actions and vice versa. So that can help you make a better decision there. And another good thing about test culture strips is that they're fairly inexpensive. Yeah, between $5, maybe $10 a test. So fairly inexpensive for the information that they give you. Second one is what we would call indicator tests. A biochemist would call them an immunoassay test, which basically means they are tests that detect and measure the presence of a certain kind of molecule in a given solution. In this case, molecules that are associated with microbes. Their advantages, they are associated with ASTM standards like D8070. Big advantage is that they are fast. They're not 3 to 5 day fast. They're like 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes fast. And that is a huge, huge plus because it means that you can use them in the field and you can get almost an instant reading right there, and then you can make decisions immediately on what you need to do before that problem really gets worse. And this ability to have fast results is really important because if you look at the ASTM regulations that govern measuring microbial contamination in fuel, that specification is D6469. It's not up there on the slide, but it's D6469. And it actually specifies that if you can't test the fuel for microbial presence on site, then you need to have the fuel tested between 4 and 24 hours after you draw the sample. Some people can't do that. So having an on-site test like this that can give you, very quick results will help you overcome that problem. So those are the advantages. They have a couple of downsides. They're not deal killers, but they are a couple of downsides. First of all, most of these indicator tests are not quantitative. Basically, they say, yes, you have a microbe problem, yes, you have a fungus problem or a bacteria problem, but they don't tell you how serious it is, so to speak. And the second thing is that they can be a little pricey. There are some out there that can cost upwards of $100 to $150 a test. For many people, that's a little bit of sticker shock. Still, for other people, they can justify that expense because they may manage millions and millions of gallons of fuel, and that expense, it may not be any problem for them to spend $150 on an immunoassay test. So it just depends who you are. Depends on your tolerance for that. Okay, third one, ATP field tests. It's a kind of newer technology, and these detect the presence, and they also measure the amount of microbial ATP that's present in a sample. They're compliant with the ASTM 4012 test, so they have an ASTM protocol associated with them. And they have some real major advantages here. First of all, like the indicators, they give you tests within a few minutes. Again, really, really valuable. However, in contrast to typical indicator tests, they actually give you a quantitative measurement of the amount of microbial presence, so to speak, in your fuel. And that can be really valuable because what you can do is you can use ATP tests and you can put them as part of your a monitoring protocol. And you can actually monitor the microbial levels in your storage tank over time. And why that matters is that when you suddenly notice it start to spike, you can then take action at that time, and that's going to be before any of these really serious and expensive problems develop. So having a quantitative test that you can do in the field and get results in the field right there is really valuable for being able to do that kind of thing. And that's why, as this kind of test gets more and more common in the industry, more and more companies and stored fuel users are going to be moving towards a model of not just preventive maintenance on their fuel, but predictive maintenance, where they're monitoring microbial levels because they couldn't do that before. Now they can, so they're monitoring microbial levels, and they're able to solve problems before they start. So that's a really neat thing that we can do now that we couldn't do before. And then lastly is they're fairly inexpensive. They're not as cheap as the first one, the culture strips, but they're a lot more valuable. Now, typically with an ATP test, you'll have a piece of hardware like a luminometer that is an initial outlay. Typically, it's maybe $3,000 or $4,000. Some companies have those where you can rent them. You can do rent to own, where they'll charge you, like $400 a month, and so you get to use it, and for after a year you own it. That helps take out the sticker shock. The actual consumables to run each test, like $10, $15 a test. That's huge compared to when you compare that and weigh that next to the benefits and the information that you're going to be getting from it. Okay, so those are three options for detecting microbial problems in fuel. If you have you get a positive test back, what kind of problems? Well, you're going to see these kind of problems referenced over and over because they're associated with a number of different tests and a number of different factors here. So if you have excess microbial presence, you got to worry about stuff like storage tank corrosion, because microbes produce acids that corrode tanks. You got to worry about fuel degradation because the microbes consume elements of the fuel and basically destroy its stability. You got to worry about biomass formation and filter plugging in the fuel storage tank rather, and all of those lead to you got to worry about whether your equipment's going to run or not. Emergency equipment failure, So, and if you think about that last one's really the big one. It's the one that many of these entities, certainly like hospitals and healthcare facilities, that's the one that they fear the most. They're okay if their storage tank has some corrosion damage in it, but they absolutely positively cannot have that emergency equipment fail when they really need it. So, what's the action step? If you have a positive microbial presence test or an excess microbial presence test is indicated, what are the implications for what you need to do? In terms of the implications, hospitals, government entities, and hospitals worry about this a lot because they both really have to be able to provide services to their constituents no matter what, and the microbial presence is a major hurdle to them doing that. Now, the ACA regulations that govern hospitals and how they treat their generators and how they treat their fuel, the ACA regulations do not spec for microbial presence. They do not say you have to do a microbial presence test. All that ACA regulations with respect to fuel require is that they follow the D975 slate. And this is a problem because if microbes were to get into that hospital's fuel, they're going to cause a lot of really, really serious and difficult problems to take care of. And if without that hospital also doing microbial presence testing, they're not going to know when this problem, when their fuel is about to reach this point. Same thing for generator users as well. They have the same concerns about reliabilities that these other people have because when you're talking about generator users, you're talking mainly about mission-critical backup generators, and they need those to run at all times. Fuel service companies and generator service companies, they're at risk for microbes causing them problems because the microbes are going to cause problems for their customers, and their customers are going to blame them for those problems. So how do you get rid of or solve a microbial presence problem in that storage tank if you do a test and it comes back positive? Well, here's what you do. First recommendation would be you need to amend your PM practice to make sure that you can detect those. Okay, so that's really a kind of a before recommendation. You want to make sure that you have regular monitoring of microbial levels in your storage tanks as a regular protocol that you do on at regular intervals, because you can use those results to predict when you're about to have that problem. Once you detect that problem, the best practices would be as follows. First thing that you would want to do is you would need to drain the water bottoms out of that fuel, and you'd need to apply biocide. Now, this is important to pay attention to. Biocide application is the most important part of this process once you remove the free water. Now, you need to make sure that you use a biocide and not a biostat. There's a difference between the two. A biocide is the only thing that actually kills the living microbes. Again, it's the only thing that actually kills them. Now, a biostat is a broader category, and a biostat is defined as something that makes it more difficult for microbes to grow, essentially. But if the microbes are already growing in that tank, it's not going to actually kill those. Now, there are plenty of fuel additives out there that run around talking about how they remove water from fuel so they kill microbes. That is absolutely, positively wrong. If they're not a biocide, if they've not been registered as a biocide, if you can't see EPA registration and fulfillment numbers on their label, they're not a biocide and they're not going to solve your microbe problem. So that's number one. Apply the biocide after you've removed the water. Then you want to filter the fuel, process it to remove any existing contaminants, plus remove the dead microbes. Because once you've killed the microbes, you still got the dead bodies in there. So you do fuel processing, filtering, that removes the microbes, removes any microbial biomass that's in the tank, and gives you cleaner fuel. Third action step is you need to use a biomass dispersant and an anti-corrosion treatment. The biomass dispersant is something you'd actually add before you added the biocide, because it will break up any biomass formations that are in that tank and actually make the biocide more effective, because the microbes won't be able to be shielded from the biocide by hiding behind their biomass formations that are stuck to the sides of the tank. But the EPA also recommends specifically these anti-corrosion treatments. Anti-corrosion treatments will basically lay down a layer of protection on tank surfaces and will actually protect those from corrosion, from things like acids and things like that. So bottom line here is that it's really important to stay on top of microbial issues, especially if your top priority is making sure that that fuel is available for emergencies. Fourth test, fuel pH level. This is pretty simple. If you remember from high school chemistry, pH is the measure of the acidity of a substance. You have a 0 to 14 pH scale, 7 being neutral. Diesel fuel typically will fall between 5.5 and let's say 8, somewhere in there. You can measure fuel pH pretty easily. Some people use chemical test strips, like those strips that you used back in chemistry lab, and those can give you a general reading. But we find that if you have a lot riding on your on getting this kind of thing right, you want to be a little bit more rigorous or a little bit more specific in your pH, and that means using a pH meter. So you also want to make sure that you take pH readings of both the fuel and the water samples, especially the water samples. In fact, if you had to choose between the two, you would choose to take the pH of the water, because if you've got an acid problem in the fuel, it's also going to show up in the water bottoms. That's in there. You take the pH, and it comes back abnormally, right? Something has to have caused that. The fuel just didn't decide to change pH on its own. Most likely cause of that is some kind of microbial activity in the fuel. A very strong correlation with that. So when we ask the question, what kind of problems can this test predict? That's number one, microbial possible microbial growth in the fuel. And from that, you've got possible tank corrosion problems and degradation of the fuel quality. They're all tied together. In terms of how these problems would impact the different market verticals, well, we would just say the same thing that we just said before, because the answers are still the same. A low pH reading in that fuel is it's an indicator that the fuel is either already degraded or that it may be on its way. And that's a nuance of it to consider, because, you know, if you're one of those people, you have stored fuel and you get fuel drops, your fuel's provided by somebody else and they bring the fuel to you. Now, you may be very, very careful and very rigorous about how you take care of your storage tanks and how you take care of your fuel. You know, you may do water monitoring, you know, every other week. You may do microbial testing on a weekly basis. You may be the most careful fuel manager in the world, but not everybody is as careful as you. And when you get fuel from somebody else, you are at the mercy of how careful they are. And it is not beyond the realm of possibility that you can inherit a pH problem from somebody else who brings you their fuel, and let's just say they weren't as careful as you are. So that's why it's important to do pH testing on your own fuel as part of your regular preventive maintenance or predictive maintenance protocol. So once you have a failing test or an abnormal test, what are your action steps? What are your possible protocols? First thing to consider is that, you know, since a low pH level is strongly indicative of microbial presence, first thing that you would do is you would do a microbial presence test to confirm that you did not have microbes in that tank. Most of the time, you will have microbes in that tank, and so, you know, and if you use a quantitative test method, like let's say an ATP test, it will tell you how serious that problem is. And so if you have established then through that secondary testing that you have microbes in that tank, well, now your action items become what we were just talking about before, the action items for solving a microbe problem. Now, what if you don't have microbes in your tank? Well, if you don't have microbes in your tank, it's still useful to treat with biocides and to get rid of the water and to do some of these things in order to make sure that fuel is as in spec as possible in those other areas. But the bottom line is that once you've corrected the other, you know, contributing problems, once you've solved the microbe problem, once you've taken the water out, you're still going to have fuel that has an acidic pH. And the question becomes, what do you do with that fuel? First thing you have to consider is there's nothing that you can add to that fuel, to that stored fuel, that is going to correct that fuel pH. I mean, sure, you could add, some kind of base, something to neutralize acid, but the problem is you don't want to do that because that's not something that's approved to put in fuel. There's nothing approved that you can put in fuel that will correct the fuel pH problem. However, good news is that you can still use acidic fuel. It's still going to burn. The other thing to consider, though, is that if you have a seriously acidic pH problem, then that's probably not the only problem that fuel is going to have. And we're not talking about microbes here. It's probably going to already be stratified. It's probably already going to have excess water and sediment in it, and you're going to have to need to clean those things up as well. And if you can't, or if the fuel is really, really, really acidic, then you're just going to have to call somebody to dispose of it. So all of this means is that you want to do everything that you can to stay on top and prevent this problem. But luckily, if you do simple things like monitoring your water, staying on top of your microbe counts, you really have a great chance of not having a fuel pH problem. And that's really the bottom line takeaway here for that. Okay, fifth test, water content test. Now, first one we talked about was water and sediment. So Are they the same? Well, as you can probably guess, no, they are not the same. So what's the difference? The water and sediment test, which was the first test that we talked about, it looks at the total free water content and sediment content in that fuel. The kind of water tests, and we're really going to be talking about two tests in this group here. The kind of water content tests we're considering here look at multiple kinds of water content, whether it's free water, emulsified water, and dissolved water, the three main kinds. Now, there's two recommendations that you should be doing if you manage fuel. The first one is probably one, if you manage any amount of fuel, you've probably already been doing this for, as long as you've been in the job, and that is sticking the tanks with water-finding paste. Simple, easy thing to do. Almost anybody can do it. All you need is a tank stick and some water-finding paste. Again, most of you probably already know how to do that. If you don't, talk to us afterwards. We've got, there's probably a blog on the Bell blog that talks about how to do that. But it will tell you the amount of free water phase that's in that tank. Now, just one thing to keep in mind about sticking tanks is you want to be consistent where you stick the tank, because if you stick the tank in the same place and you do that over time, multiple times, that gives you consistency in your readings, and you can meaningfully compare them. Another thing to consider is that storage tanks have the tendency, sometimes they can shift and they can settle after they're in the ground, and many times you're going to find a storage tank that's actually tilted. One end is a little bit higher than the other. And that means if you were to stick the tank on one end, the water level that you detect may not be as high as if you were to stick it on the other end, because the water has rolled downhill because the tank's not level. So that's just something to keep in mind. The other main test is called a Carl Fisher titration test. That's kind of the dominant test, or the most widely used water detection test, when you need to have a highly accurate quantitative measurement of the percentage of all kinds of water in your fuel, not just free water, not just some of that emulsified water like you can see here, all of the water in there. Carl Fisher tests are run by any number of labs. You just send a sample off to them. Costs like a couple $100, but if you're managing large amounts of fuel, a couple $100, it may not be all that amount to pay. Bottom line here is that you need to monitor water content and make sure that it doesn't get out of hand, because water content is a strong contributing factor to a bunch of different causes of fuel problems in that fuel. Talking about, obviously microbial growth. We've already established that microbes need water. If you have excess water content in there, then it's very likely that you're going to develop a serious microbial problem. Tank corrosion contributes to that. It can contribute to equipment damage if you get some of that free water sucked up. It can damage fuel injectors. It can cause problems with common rail diesel engines. It's really a problem for anyone that has stored fuel. So, in view of all this, one thing that we can conclude is that monitoring your water content has a really high, really high diagnostic value because of the number of serious problems that water content is associated with. So, action steps. You have excess water content in there. What should you do about it? Well, once you detect water content, it's not that hard to remediate, and you have several options to consider. If you have excessive free water, like you stick the tank and you get you have more than, let's say, a quarter to a half inch of water phase, then you're going to want to mechanically remove as much of that free water as possible, whether pumping it out or draining it out, depending on the design of your tank. Next thing that you would want to consider is using some kind of water scavenging fuel treatment, or if you have emulsified water in there, you're going to need to add a demulsification fuel treatment. Now, a demulsification treatment, what that's going to do, you would actually add that first, and it would actually break that emulsion and cause that emulsified water to separate from the fuel and drop down to the bottom of the tank, where you can then mechanically remove it. Now, third thing that you would want to consider is to have some kind of fuel processing, fuel servicing. Some people would call it fuel polishing. We typically refer to it as mechanical fuel filtration, fuel servicing. That's one of the main things that they do, is they filter out water. So you want to get a good fuel service company to remove as much of that water as possible. So the bottom line takeaway here with respect to test number 5, water monitoring should be a regular part of fuel monitoring for anyone who has a significant amount of stored fuel, whether you're a hospital, whether you're a government entity, whether you're a non-retail fuel user, or whether you're a backup generator owner. You really need to monitor your water content at regular intervals because of the possible problems that it can be associated with. Okay. 6th and final test. This is an important one, fuel stability tests. Now, stability tests, categorically, they measure the ability of the fuel to resist changes to its composition over time. This is what people mean when they talk about a fuel's storage stability. When you leave fuel in a storage tank under regular ambient conditions, it's exposed over time to oxygen, to heat, maybe some water gets in there. How well or how long will the fuel stay in its original state, or how quickly will it react and oxidize and stratify and form solids and gums and sludge and all that stuff? That's the kind of thing that fuel stability testing gives you a window into, so to speak. So there are at least a couple of tests that measure stability. The two main kind that people tend to hear of, first is called a thermal stability test, or they might call it an accelerated thermal stability test. That is not the one that we're talking about here, but it is one that you will hear of. If you nose around and do a little bit of research, you'll see this one referenced. All that one basically tells you is how stable will the fuel be if it's kept at elevated temperatures for a long period of time. But the one that we're recommending here is this ASTM D2274 test. It's known as an oxidative stability test, or some people would call that accelerated stability or accelerated oxidative stability. Basically, what it focuses on is how stable is the fuel when it's exposed to oxygen. And as we know, that's pretty much all fuel is exposed to oxygen as it's stored out in the real world. So to do this test, they take a fuel sample, they warm it up, and they put it in a chamber where they expose it to a lot of oxygen over an accelerated period of time. And what that does is it causes the fuel to form sediments and form sludge and to form solids at a faster rate, but in the same way that it would do it if you just left it out in the storage tank. They're just speeding up the process. Then they isolate those, and they measure how much how much solid content that fuel generated. And so what this is able to tell them then is how likely or how quickly is that fuel going to go bad, form solids and stratify and all that stuff in the near future. So fuel stability testing is really important to monitor the condition of your stored fuel so that you can predict possible problems that may be coming. Now, important thing to remember is that fuel stability testing is predictive. The results of the test predict the fuel's condition and predict its state of stability at some point in the future. And that's a little bit different from something like a water and sediment test. The water and sediment test tells you the amount of sediment that's currently existing in the fuel right now at the time that you test it. This test tells you how quickly can you expect this fuel to form solids and sediment and to go bad in the future. And that can be really important for any keeper of stored fuel, so to speak. So from this test, you get a predictive score that illustrates the state of the fuel in your tank and what it's likely to do in the future. if you have a subpar score on this test, what kind of problems could that infer that might be on the horizon for you? Well, again, the answer is a lot of the same problems we've been talking about. We're talking about stuff like reduced combustion properties. Fuel that has a high amount of solid content in it is not going to burn as completely as fresh, healthy fuel will. Is it going to form injector and engine deposits, which of course would lead to performance issues and elevated black smoke, stuff like that? And is it going to have? Are you going to have performance uncertainty for the critical equipment? If you have fuel that's severely unstable, it may not be able to sustain proper engine operation, and that is a serious potential problem for places like, for government entities that serve constituents, backup generator owners, mission criticals, hospitals and healthcare, all those people. That's a really serious problem for them. And then lastly, it relates to, polishing service efficacy or fuel filtration efficacy. We mentioned this earlier with the water and sediment test, but it's exactly the same thing. A fuel servicer can use an accelerated oxidative stability test to show the customer that your fuel was unstable before. We did the service, now it's back in spec, your fuel has changed for the better, here's the proof. And the customer says, hey, that's awesome. Now I don't just have to assume that you did something good, I have the proof right here in my hand. That's a win-win situation for all those people. So, with respect to what to do about a failed stability test, because it's a predictive test, you actually have two kinds of remediative action to consider here. First thing that you would need to do is you would need to do something to remove the existing molecular precursors that are already in the fuel. Fuel that has, you can't always see molecular precursors in the fuel. So a fuel may look healthy, but it may actually have heavy molecules that have formed that are in that fuel, but they're not big enough for you to be able to see them with the naked eye. But when you put them in an accelerated environment like this test does, they form sludge and solids faster, and the fuel does worse on the test. So what you want to do, first of all, is you want to remove the solids and you want to remove the precursors by having a good mechanical cleaning, mechanical filtration service done on that test. That should be able to markedly improve the stability score of your fuel. Then the second thing that you would want to do is you would want to treat the fuel with a good chemical stabilizer in order to prevent the formation of insolubles in the future. And that's why we talk about a complete solution for fuel involves both things. It involves mechanical filtration or some kind of mechanical servicing of the fuel and chemical treatment, because each one of those covers an aspect of the situation better than the other one does. So you need to use both of them together. Okay, so with that, we have covered the bulk of the information that we need to cover. Typically, what we do here now is we do a quick review. Just because you know what they say, if you want to have the best learning experience, you say what you're going to say, you say it, and then you talk about what you said. Last thing to throw in here as we start to wind this down is, we've had these 6 tests: water and sediment, fuel pH, microbial presence and water presence, cetane index, fuel stability. Those are the 6 tests that we picked out as being the ones that we feel are the most important ones to concentrate on. There are other tests you can do. You can have a sulfur content test, or you can have a distillation test. You can measure any number of things. But these 6 tests, we feel, are the best combination of being the most meaningful / most important and the easiest ones for the user to run or have run on their behalf. Okay, so real fast, what are the 6 tests that we covered? Okay, water and sediment test gives you a picture of the viability of the fuel at a specific time because it documents the level of contaminants present in the fuel. The microbial presence test documents how much microbial presence you have, which makes it very important for being able to keep on top of what is pretty much the most problematic, most damaging element to the universe of fuel storage. It's microbes. And so microbial presence tests would be pretty essential to sound decision making on how and when to use, let's say, biocide treatments. Cetane index test documents the combustion quality of the fuel at a given time and gives you a strong inference on whether the fuel can support full load usage by, let's say, emergency equipment. Fourth one, fuel pH, is easy to do, and it can give you a warning sign that damaging conditions are forming in that storage tank, especially with respect to inferring possible microbial activity along with it. Fifth one, water content test, essential element of proper fuel preventive maintenance. It's linked to microbial presence. It's linked to possible fuel instability. It's linked to storage tank corrosion, and it's not a hard set of tests to do. And then the last one, fuel stability, is the predictive test, but it's essential to have run because it really gives you a good picture of the fuel's ability to withstand changes to its condition in the near future. And then, of course, not only have we been talking about why each test was important, what we have tried to do throughout this is we tried to link all of these to the specific kinds of people who have stored fuel. What are the values that these tests have for them? So let's tie things up here by talking about those people. Remember, government entities. Government entities serve constituents that rely on them for services, so they pay attention to fuel tests that increase their ability to do this. Generator dealers and generator service companies, especially the service companies, their business is to get their customer exactly what they need, which is peace of mind that the generator they bought will meet their expectations by operating as needed when needed. So a service company is going to want to do tests that give them an accurate picture of the generator fuel's ability to do that. Hospitals and healthcare facilities. One of the big things that they want to do is they want to stay on the right side of the regulations that they're required to fall under. The regulations that ultimately aim to make sure they can provide critical services to their constituents, so to speak, their patients, at all times. So they're going to want to pay attention to these tests that enable them to do that. And then last one, fuel servicing companies, since they essentially service other people's stored fuel, they don't have their own, the tests that they're going to get the most value from are the ones that enable them to show their customers that their services were changed the fuel for the better. So hopefully, after our time, here together today, you have a clearer picture of how these 6 recommended tests really bring a high value in enabling all of these people and more to do what they most need to do. So as we wrap this up, if you have questions, and let's see, Michael's already submitted one, so we'll answer that here in a moment. This is a lot of information, and typically at the end of these kind of webinars, I always give my email address, ebjornstedt@bellperformance.net. If you have a question, if you wake up in the middle of the night and say, oh my gosh, I forgot to ask him, blah, 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 send me an email. Let me know that you were in the webinar. Let me know how you liked it or you didn't like it. Hopefully you liked it. But tell me, ask me whatever questions you need. I will be glad to do my best to get you the best information that I can. Many of you are already familiar with the Bell Performance website, bellperformance.com. We always have a lot of great information on there, especially on the Bell Performance blog. We have a business blog and a consumer blog. So a lot of these topics that we talked about have been touched upon and covered in blog articles in the past. And you can search for those blog articles. We've got probably 5 years worth of articles saved on the site. There's other helpful resources and downloads that are also available on the site as well. So if you're not familiar with it already, we strongly encourage you to take advantage of that as much as possible. And then last thing before we get to questions, the Bell Fuel and Tank Services. Okay, this is something, as I said when I first started off, I talked about the fact we've been doing business for a long time. We have a lot of customers in all of those areas that we discussed: government entities, generator dealers, hospitals and healthcare. And we do a lot of service work with them, helping them to try and keep their stored fuel in, as problem-free a state as possible. A lot of these elements that we've covered are elements that we really emphasize as part of how we operate the Bell Fuel and Tank Services, or what we might call Bell FTS. The Bell Fuel and Tank Services really has what we call a hybrid complete approach to fuel management is what we stress. So we utilize high quality mechanical fuel and tank cleaning. Of course, we combine them with the best quality chemical treatment. So again, remember the biocide. It's really important to have a good quality biocide. We have that. Fuel stability treatments, anti-corrosion treatments, sludge dispersants and biomass dispersants. So high quality treatments paired with mechanical fuel cleaning to really target all of the important areas that stored fuel customers need. And then the last part, the whole overriding topic of this webinar, fuel testing. The best service, most complete service needs to have all three of these arms. That's what Bell Fuel and Tank Services does. And in the end, our aim with that is to give our stored fuel customers exactly what they need while avoiding them having to pay for things they don't. Because Lord knows if it's ever happened to you, that's just as bad, is feeling like you paid for something that you really didn't need. So if this is something that resonates with you in your sphere of influence, in the area that you're doing business with, we'd definitely be interested in talking with you more about what you need and if and how we can help you, solve your problems with the Bell Fuel and Tank Services program. So that brings us to the end here, which means questions. And so the first question we have, Michael's asking, how do you test for the amount of dissolved air content in the diesel fuel? And I'm not going to be one of those people that tries to make something up. I know you can do it, but I'm not 100% sure right now what the name of the test is that would do that. So, Michael, what I will do is I can source that information and let you know. Dissolved air content in fuel, all fuel, like all fuel has a certain amount of dissolved water. Many kinds of fuel have a certain amount of dissolved air in them. And excess dissolved air, whether it got entrained in there from, excess movement of the fuel, that can cause certain amounts of problems, because if you're forcing an amount of oxygen can have reactive species. Oxygen can contribute to oxidation, which can speed up the stratification and the degradation of that fuel. So sometimes it is useful to have a test to do that. It's not one of the tests that we necessarily would say is the most important, but for some people in some areas it definitely is. Now, another question that we have been asked, earlier we talked about fuel stabilizers in the last test. One of the things that is implied as an action step is you want to, after you've mechanically processed and filtered all the precursors out, you want to use a good fuel stabilizer. Now, the question that stems from that is, what is a good fuel stabilizer? Because a fleet manager for a government entity does not know whether some bottle of something that has fuel stabilizer on it is any good or not. So what are the hallmarks of what you should be looking for when you're selecting a good fuel stabilizer? Well, the bottom line with that is that fuel stabilizer is not one thing. It's a combination of four, maybe five different types of active ingredients, and each one of those targets or solves one aspect of this big thing that's known as fuel instability. A good fuel stabilizer will have, first and foremost, it'll have an antioxidant. Antioxidant will stop oxidation reactions from stuff like what Michael was talking about, dissolved air content, but just simple exposure to oxygen as the fuel sits there in the storage tank. That happens to all fuel, all stored fuel. So it needs to have antioxidant. It also needs to have what they call an antiperoxidal. Peroxides are certain kinds of molecules that form over time and contribute to instability in that fuel. And that's an especially big problem if the fuel has biodiesel in it, which most diesel fuel nowadays has up to 5% biodiesel content. So you need an antiperoxidal component to halt the formation of those components, which extends the fuel storage life. You need a metal deactivator. Fuels get exposed to catalytic metals, certain kinds of catalytic metals like copper, like brass, like bronze. If the fuel gets exposed to those, it catalytically speeds up reactions that degrade the fuel. So you want a metal deactivator in there. And then you also want something like a dispersant. What a dispersant will do is if some heavy molecules do happen to form in that fuel, it will actually target those, and it will keep them away from each other. It will keep them dispersed in the fuel. The longer you can keep heavy molecules away from each other, if they come up against each other, they'll stick together, they'll get bigger and bigger and bigger. So the longer you can keep them dispersed and away from each other, the longer time it will take for them to grow and increase in size, and therefore, the longer your fuel will stay stable. So those four things, if someone was to ask me, how do I know a good stabilizer from the bad, that's probably what I would recommend is make sure that it has a combination of those kind of things. And then last question here, unless somebody else wants to submit one in the chat box. Last question, when we talk about cetane improvers, and we talked about the cetane index test, and we said, cetane index test is really useful and important for documenting the starting value of the fuel, but you can't use it to detect when you've added a certain amount of cetane improver. You can't use it to document how much that has improved. And so what we were getting at is that unless you want to spend $1,000 or so to run a cetane number test, the D617, then really you're going to have to rely on the partner, the company that you're working with that's servicing the fuel. You need to have confidence that they are a good partner, that they have your best interests in mind. Well, everybody says, you ask everybody, are you any good? Well, of course I'm good. So, how do you know how can you tell a good fuel service partner from a not so good one? Besides just asking them and letting them tell you. Well, there are a few certain things that you can look for. I mean, do they have a good reputation, long-standing reputation in the industry? That doesn't tell you everything, but it does tell you something. This one's very important. Do they give honest answers? If you ask them a question, do you get the sense that they're trying to BS you, so to speak, or will they tell you something that is not going to get them business? I mean, that's a big one. If they're willing to tell you, hey, you really don't need to do this, even if that they're talking about is, going to mean they can do a $5,000 fuel polishing job on, if they are committed to giving you honest answers and accurate answers, and if they're willing to show you that they will put your best interests over theirs, those are some big ones with respect to whether you can tell or whether you can predict if somebody that wants to do business with you is a good one or not. So look for signs that they're willing to put your interests ahead of their own. That's a couple of things that you can look out for. Okay, so I think that we've had a good time today. I hope that everyone has found this useful. We'll be sending out an email with the link to the webinar recording. So in case you missed it or you weren't able to stay for the whole thing, then you'll be able to access the whole thing through the recording. So anyway, again, thank you very much for joining me for this webinar on fuel tests that you need to know about. Hopefully, again, if you have any questions, let me know. Email me. And in advance of that, thanks for joining me. And we will see you all next time. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.